Part 1, The Pattern That Doesn't Miss. There is a shape in history that keeps returning. A four-step pattern that does not care about flags, ideologies, or languages. Rome took nearly 200 years to fade out, decaying slowly from the 3rd to the 5th century. But three later empires, the Ottoman, British, and Soviet, did not get centuries. They each collapsed in less than a single lifetime. The Ottomans lost 85% of their territory in just 40 years. The British went from ruling a quarter of the planet to ruling scraps in about 50 years. The Soviet Union went from nuclear superpower to non-existent in 11 years, with the final fall packed into 900 days. Three empires. Three different religions, cultures, and systems: Islamic monarchy, liberal parliamentary empire, atheist communist superstate. And yet, the same four stages. Peak dominance. Overextension. Peripheral losses. Core collapse. The names change. The uniforms change. The curve of the story does not. And right now, in 2025, whether we like it or not, the American-led order is already in stage 3. This isn't a story about a far-off future. It's a story about the room you're in right now, the money in your bank account, the passport in your drawer, and how all of that sits inside a system that has already entered the same sequence that destroyed 3 empires before it. To see where we're going, we have to understand why modern empires don't die slowly like Rome. They hold together, and then they snap. Why Rome is the exception. Rome's long, slow fall feels natural to us. Border wars, barbarian invasions, plagues, bad emperors, all stretched across generations. From the outside, it looks like a tired giant sinking into the mud 1 inch at a time. But Rome was pre-modern. Messages moved at the speed of a horse. Orders traveled by ship. Armies marched, they didn't fly. Economies were regional, not tightly wired together. If a province rebelled on the empire's edge, it could be months before Rome even heard about it, and more months before an army arrived. The empire could be losing territory in one direction while still functioning normally in another. Information was local. Money was local. Collapse was local. Today, empires sit on a very different kind of stage. Why modern collapse is sudden. Modern power rests on 3 pillars. Instant communication. Rapid military projection. Tightly integrated finance. The telegraph made empires faster. The radio and telephone made them instantaneous. The internet and real-time capital flows made them hypersensitive. Now, when something cracks on the periphery, news travels globally in seconds. Markets react in minutes. Allies reevaluate their loyalties in days, not decades. You no longer get the luxury of a slow-motion fall. Once confidence breaks, it propagates like a financial and political earthquake, shockwaves bouncing rapidly through markets, alliances, and currencies. That's why the modern pattern is not slow decay but sudden fracture. Empires look stable, invincible even, right up until they don't. The Ottomans, the British, the Soviets. Each held the illusion of permanence, right up until the system they sat on top of flipped in a very short window of time. And underneath those dramatic endings, the same 4-stage sequence repeats. The 4-stage pattern. Stage 1, peak dominance. The empire bestrides its world like a colossus. It controls vast territories and crucial trade routes. Its military wins or intimidates its enemies. Its currency is accepted everywhere. Its diplomats write the rules others have to follow. But the most important feature of Stage 1 isn't tanks or ships. It's belief. Everyone, both inside and outside the empire, assumes it's permanent. People plan careers, investments, even revolutions under the assumption that this empire will always be there. Stage 2, overextension. Success breeds promises. Bases multiply. Treaties multiply. Obligations multiply. The empire. Guarantees security for far-flung allies. Patrols shipping lanes on multiple oceans. Runs occupations, covert operations, proxy wars. Supports a lifestyle at home that depends on cheap credit and foreign resources. Costs quietly slip above revenues. The treasury borrows to cover the gap, convinced it's temporary, or that growth will bail it out later. From the outside, the empire still looks strong. From the inside, the budget spreadsheets are beginning to scream. Stage 3, peripheral losses. This is where denial collides with reality. Outlying territories, colonies, or satellite states begin to drift away. They hedge, they negotiate, they revolt. Allies sign new trade deals that bypass the empire's currency. Puppet regimes decide they'd rather not be puppets. Strategic regions nationalize assets the empire thought it controlled. The empire fights one crisis at a time, but each victory is more expensive and less decisive. The crucial part. Once the first defection succeeds, everyone else begins to ask the same question. If they got away with it, why can't we? That's when stage 3 accelerates. In finance, this looks like a run. In geopolitics, it looks like a cascade. Stage 4, core collapse. From a distance, it looks like the empire fell in a single moment. A coup, a revolution, a crash. But stage 4 is more like a ceiling giving way after decades of hidden rot. The financial system breaks. The currency implodes or the state defaults. The military can't be paid, or won't obey. The central government loses control, over its borders, its provinces, even its own capital. The empire doesn't gently step down. It disappears. The Ottomans became Turkey. The British Empire dissolved into a mid-sized European country with nostalgic museums. The Soviet Union fractured into 15 independent states in less than 3 years. Now, to understand how quickly this can happen, we start with the first modern empire to ride this pattern all the way to the end. The Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man at his peak. In 1880, the Ottoman Empire had already existed for more than 600 years. From Istanbul, the Sultan ruled a realm that stretched across the Balkans in Europe, through the Middle East, down into North Africa. Roughly 5 million square kilometers, about twice the size of modern Iran. Vast. Multi-ethnic. Historically feared. This was stage 1, peak dominance, at least on the surface. The Ottomans controlled the land bridge between Europe and Asia. Access to the Black Sea. The holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. For centuries, European leaders had lived with the nightmare that Ottoman armies might one day reach Vienna or beyond. By the late 19th century, the frontiers had shifted, but the memory of that fear still lingered. If you were living inside that empire in 1880, it would have been very easy to believe. We have been here for 6 centuries. We will be here forever. But below that ancient prestige, the structure was already hollowing out. Inside stage 2, rot behind the grandeur. Financially, the Ottomans were broken. Decades of borrowing from European banks had created a mountain of external debt. By 1876, the Ottoman government simply could not pay. They defaulted. In response, European creditors didn't just send angry letters, they took control. Through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, foreign bankers began to collect Ottoman taxes directly, skimming off repayments before the imperial government in Istanbul saw a single coin. Imagine an empire where your customs revenues and salt taxes are being managed by committees in Paris and London. That's not sovereignty. That's foreclosure. Militarily, the picture was no better. European powers had embraced railroads for rapid troop movement. Telegraph lines for instant orders. Industrial-scale weapon production. The Ottomans were still fighting with tactics closer to Napoleon's era than to the industrial 20th century about to arrive. They had already lost wars to Russia. They had already lost control of Greece, Serbia, and Romania. The empire that once terrified Europe was now described in diplomatic language as the sick man of Europe. A body still standing, but kept upright by habit and inertia. And socially, the foundations were fracturing. The empire was a mosaic. Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Slavs. As nationalism spread through Europe in the 19th century, these groups began to ask the same question. Why should we stay inside a failing multi-ethnic empire when others are creating independent nation-states? The Ottoman center in Istanbul was trying to hold together an empire where major populations no longer wanted to be ruled from there. Too many commitments. Too few resources. An aging army. Foreign-controlled finances. Restless populations. This was stage 2, overextension in slow motion. And like every overextended empire, the Ottomans were about to learn that the real danger isn't at the center. It starts at the edges. In 1908, the first crack opened, not from a foreign army, but from inside the empire's own officer corps. And once that crack appeared, the vultures circling overhead didn't just watch. They moved. Part 2, The Ottoman Endgame, How an Empire Vanishes. In 1908, the first fracture came from within. Not from Russian artillery. Not from British diplomacy. From the empire's own junior officers. A group of reformist military officers and intellectuals, known as the Young Turks, decided the old system could no longer be patched. They were patriots, but not loyalists. Their conclusion was brutal. If we don't change the system, the empire dies. If we change the system, we might still die, but at least we have a chance. They chose the gamble. The Young Turk Revolution, renewal or reveal. In 1908, the Young Turks staged a revolution. They forced Sultan Abdülhamid II to restore the 1876 constitution. Reopen parliament. Accept a new political order where his power would be constrained. This was not an invasion. It wasn't a foreign coup. It was the empire's own military and bureaucratic elite saying, the way we've been ruling cannot continue. On paper, this should have been a moment of rebirth. A chance to modernize the army. Reform finances. Introduce a constitutional system. Rally the empire's populations behind a shared project. Instead, the revolution exposed something terrifying. If junior officers could force the Sultan to change the constitution at gunpoint, how much authority did Istanbul really have? The answer came almost immediately. When the vultures move in. In the same year as the Young Turk Revolution, 1908, the empire's neighbors smelled opportunity. Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia, a formerly Ottoman territory it had been administering since the Congress of Berlin. Bulgaria declared full independence, cutting the last formal tie with Ottoman suzerainty. Then, in 1911, Italy invaded Libya, one of the last Ottoman holdings in North Africa. Like sharks testing a bleeding animal, the great powers and small national states alike all asked, how much of this old empire can we carve away before it finally falls? The answer came in the brutal test of the Balkan Wars. The Balkan Wars, Stage 3 ignites. By 1912, 4 small Balkan states, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, formed a coalition. Their goal was unapologetic. Take what remains of Ottoman Europe. They believed what the maps already hinted. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a predator. It was prey. The First Balkan War, 1912 to 1913, was shockingly fast. In just 8 months, the Ottomans lost about 83% of their European territory. And around 69% of their European population. Cities that had been Ottoman for centuries, even 500 years, were gone. Thessaloniki. Vast swaths of Macedonia. Most of Albania. key strategic towns and regions that had long anchored Ottoman power in the Balkans. For local populations, this wasn't abstract geopolitics. It was sudden border change. Muslim communities fled in panic. Christians, long under Ottoman rule, woke up under new flags. Ethnic violence erupted in pockets across the region. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees poured into Anatolia and remaining Ottoman lands, needing food, housing, and work. The empire, already teetering under crushing debt, now had to absorb a humanitarian disaster. Militarily, the humiliation was complete. The Ottoman army, the supposed backbone of the empire, had been shattered by a coalition of small states that had once feared Ottoman power. Stage 3, peripheral losses, was now unmistakable. The empire tried to stand back up. A last gamble, World War I. After the Balkan Wars, the young Turk leadership, now effectively running the state, tightened its grip. They purged opponents, centralized decision-making, pushed for accelerated reform. But reform takes time. Debt does not wait. Neither do rivals. In 1914, the world slid into catastrophe. World War I began. The Ottoman leadership faced a choice. Stay neutral, try to rebuild, hope to be ignored. Or choose a side, gamble the last strength of the empire on a big win. They chose to bet everything. The Ottomans allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, against Britain, France, and Russia. It was a decision made from a position of weakness, not strength. The logic being, if we side with the rising powers and they win, we might regain what we lost. Instead, they tied the fate of their battered empire to a war they were not prepared to fight. From 1914 to 1918, the Ottomans fought on multiple fronts. Against Russia in the Caucasus. Against Britain in Mesopotamia and Palestine. Against British and Anzac forces at Gallipoli. Against internal revolts and uprisings within the empire. The human cost was staggering. Out of roughly 2.8 million Ottoman subjects who served in the military, around 725,000 died. Another 400,000 were wounded. Remember, the empire's total population was roughly 23 million. This wasn't just a war. It was demographic trauma. An already indebted, overstretched empire was now bleeding out its young men in a global conflict it had little chance of winning. By 1918, the outcome was clear. Germany surrendered. The Ottoman government collapsed. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. The empire had lost. Now it would be carved up. Treaty of Sèvres, the execution document. In 1920, the victorious powers drafted the Treaty of Sèvres, a document that was not a peace deal so much as a dismantling plan. The treaty reduced Turkey to a small Anatolian core. Assigned eastern Anatolia to a proposed Armenian state. Granted parts of southern Anatolia to France. Gave the Aegean coast, including Smyrna, Izmir, to Greece. Put Istanbul and the Straits under international control. The Ottoman Empire, as a political entity, was meant to be finished. This should have been straightforward. Stage 4, core collapse. An exhausted, defeated empire, occupied by foreign troops, sliced into pieces by treaty. But history, here, had one more twist. Ataturk, the empire dies, but a new state emerges. One man refused to accept the script. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, a general who had already distinguished himself at Gallipoli, rejected the Treaty of Sèvres as national suicide. From 1919 to 1922, he organized a Turkish nationalist resistance based in Anatolia. Turkish nationalist forces fought. Greek troops in western Anatolia. French forces in the south. Armenian forces in the east. Local collaborators and remaining imperial loyalists. Against expectations, they won. By 1922, foreign forces had been driven out of most Anatolia. The Nationalist Assembly in Ankara abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. On November 1, 1922, after 623 years, the Ottoman Empire officially ceased to exist. In its place, a new entity emerged. The Republic of Turkey, a secular, nationalist state that deliberately rejected the imperial framework it had inherited. The empire and the dynasty were gone. The flag, language, and much of the population remained, but the political organism called the Ottoman Empire was dead. From peak in the 1880s to dissolution in 1922, the process took about 42 years. But most of the real destruction was compressed into just a decade. 1912 to 1913, Balkan Wars. 1914 to 1918, World War I. 1919 to 1922, Turkish War of Independence. 10 years. That's one working lifetime. That's the difference between a teenager and a parent. The lesson of the Ottoman collapse. From the outside, for decades, the Ottomans looked weak but stable. A sick man, yes, but still standing. They lost the Balkans in 1912 to 1913. Lost World War I in 1918. Kept the legal shell of the empire until 1922. And then, almost overnight in historical terms, it was gone. That is the core lesson. An empire can appear intact even after fatal damage has already occurred. The paperwork survives. The palaces stand. The flags still fly. Until, very suddenly, they don't. The Ottomans were the first modern empire to ride the four-stage curve all the way down. They were not the last. Because less than 2 decades after the Ottoman Sultanate vanished, another empire, richer, larger, more civilized, more confident, was stepping into stage 1 at its absolute peak. An empire that claimed the sun never set on its dominions. The British Empire. And its collapse would follow the same pattern. Not over 200 years like Rome. But in the span of a single long human life. Part 3, The British Empire, How the Largest Empire in History Crumbled in One Generation. When the Ottoman Empire finally vanished in 1922, the world's center of gravity had already shifted. Britain, victorious in World War I, ruler of the seas, master of global finance, stood at the apex of its power. This was stage 1, peak dominance in its purest form. At the end of World War I in 1918, the British Empire controlled 35.5 million square kilometers of territory. Roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. Governed over 500 million people, 1 out of every 4 humans alive. From Canada to India, Australia to Egypt, South Africa to Hong Kong, the empire stretched across every time zone. The cliché was true. The sun literally never set on British rule. Britain possessed the world's most powerful navy. The world's financial capital, London. The world's reserve currency, the pound sterling. A global network of military bases, trade outposts, and colonial administrations. To the British ruling class, this was destiny, proof that British civilization had earned its position at the top of the world. Rudyard Kipling wrote of the white man's burden. Winston Churchill claimed the empire would last 1,000 years. The British public believed history had chosen them. But beneath the pomp, the empire's foundations were already shaking. Because World War I, the very event that seemed to prove Britain's supremacy, had quietly delivered the empire its fatal wound. Stage 2, the cost of victory, overextension begins. Before 1914, Britain was the planet's largest creditor nation. British banks lent money to governments across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. British investment built railways in South America. Mines in Africa. Factories in Asia. Shipping routes across the globe. The empire didn't just rule the world politically, it financed it. World War I flipped this system upside down. The war cost Britain over £4 billion, around $1 trillion today. To pay for it, Britain borrowed massively from the United States. By 1918, Britain owed America more than its entire GDP. The global banker had become the global debtor. And debt is not just a number, it is a leash. Yet on the surface, life continued. In the 1920s, Britain still appeared powerful. The pound was still widely used. The Royal Navy still dominated the seas. Colonies still sent taxes, goods, and soldiers. But financial cracks were widening beneath the imperial facade. 1931, the sound of a system breaking. In 1931, Britain suffered a financial crisis so severe it was forced to abandon the gold standard, the foundation of global confidence in the pound for nearly a century. Overnight, the pound lost 25% of its value. Investors around the world panicked. Britain's claim to financial supremacy was exposed as illusion. The empire still existed, but the economic engine that powered it was running on fumes. This was the heart of Stage 2, overextension. The empire required a navy to patrol global shipping lanes, troops stationed on multiple continents, administrators overseeing dozens of colonies, constant economic subsidies to maintain loyalty and stability. And Britain simply no longer had the money. But the true breaking point came with the next global war. World War II, the empire's final bill arrives. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain entered what would become a 6-year slide toward bankruptcy. World War II cost Britain over £120 billion in today's terms. Once again, Britain borrowed, primarily from the United States. By 1945, Britain was effectively insolvent. The country couldn't feed itself. Rationing continued until 1954, 9 years after the war ended. The empire had survived militarily, but economically it was dead. This was the quiet threshold into Stage 3, peripheral losses. Because an empire without wealth is simply geography with nostalgia. And the first territory to test Britain's weakness was the empire's beating heart. India. 1947, the loss of India, the moment the empire died. India was not just another colony. It was the crown jewel, the source of troops, resources, prestige, trade wealth, strategic positioning. For nearly 200 years, British rule in India had been justified as civilizing mission and economic necessity. But after World War II, Britain no longer had the financial or military strength to suppress India's independence movement. Maintaining control became impossible. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India, Pakistan, later, Burma. This was not a philosophical embrace of self-determination. It was economic surrender. Once India was gone, the empire lost its gravitational center. The psychological impact was enormous. If Britain cannot hold India, what can it hold? The answer arrived 9 years later. 1956, the Suez Crisis, the moment the world learned Britain was no longer a superpower. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, one of the key arteries of British global power. Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation to take it back. Militarily, the operation succeeded. British and French forces seized the canal zone. But then something happened that had never happened before. The United States, supposedly Britain's closest ally, ordered Britain to withdraw. President Eisenhower threatened to dump British bonds, collapse the pound, trigger a British financial crisis. Britain obeyed. It had no choice. The message was unmistakable. Britain was no longer a global power. It was America's junior partner. The empire died at Suez, not with gunfire, but with a phone call. After Suez, the collapse accelerated. Avalanche, the end of the world's largest empire. Between 1956 and 1970, colonies peeled away at breakneck speed. Ghana, 1957. Nigeria, 1960. Kenya, 1963. Zambia, 1964. Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, 1960s. Dozens of smaller territories soon followed. Country after country raised a new flag. The empire emptied out like a building collapsing floor by floor until only the foundation remained. By 1970, the British Empire existed only on maps of the past. From peak in 1918 to practical dissolution in 1970, 52 years. Almost exactly the same collapse duration as the Ottomans. And like the Ottomans, most of the actual damage was concentrated in a very short period. 1945 to 1970. Just 25 years. One generation. The lesson of the British collapse. Britain did not fall because it was morally weaker than its rivals or less intelligent than its ancestors. It fell because empires built on financial dominance die when the money runs out. Military power cannot compensate for economic insolvency. Once the periphery leaves, the core becomes irrelevant. Unlike the Ottomans, Britain did not disappear entirely. The nation remained, but the empire vanished. The British people had believed it would last forever. The world believed it would last forever. But no empire survives a broken balance sheet. And the next empire to face the pattern was one that believed itself immune to the laws of history. The Soviet Union. A superstate with the largest tank army on Earth. The most nuclear warheads ever assembled by humans. And an ideology that claimed to be the future of mankind. Its fall would be the fastest of all. And the one most similar to what America is experiencing today. Part 4, The Soviet Collapse and the American Parallel, the fastest fall in history. In 1980, the Soviet Union stood at the height of its power. A nuclear superpower. A global ideological force. A military colossus with 5 million active personnel, more than 50,000 tanks, and a blue-water navy. It controlled Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Pact. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. It supported allies, even puppet governments, across the globe. Cuba. Vietnam. Angola. Ethiopia. Syria. Nicaragua. This was Stage 1, peak dominance, Soviet style. To many outside observers, and especially within the Politburo, the USSR looked eternal. It had survived the Russian Civil War. It had defeated Nazi Germany. It had launched the first satellite. It had put the first human in space. It had reached nuclear parity with the United States. But this appearance of permanence hid a truth that would soon erupt. The Soviet Empire was not stable, it was stretched. And one miscalculation would push it directly into Stage 2, overextension, triggering the fastest imperial collapse the world has ever seen. Afghanistan, the grave where the Soviet Empire began to die. On December 24, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The leadership in Moscow expected a quick stabilization operation. A short conflict. A friendly communist government installed and protected. They were disastrously wrong. The war lasted 10 years. Over 600,000 Soviet troops rotated through Afghanistan. The Soviet military lost 15,000 soldiers killed. 53,000 wounded. Billions of rubles drained away. The war revealed a brutal truth Moscow had tried to hide. The Soviet military could intimidate Eastern Europe. But it couldn't defeat mountain insurgents funded by the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a slow bleed of money, legitimacy, and morale. At the same time, oil prices, the USSR's most crucial source of hard currency, collapsed. $35 per barrel in 1980. Down to $10 by 1986. The Soviet system, never efficient, now faced falling revenue. Rising military expenditures. A population losing faith. A leadership losing direction. This was stage 2, overextension hitting its crisis point. The empire was overcommit abroad and decaying at home. But then, leadership changed, and the next decision would trigger stage 3 in the most dramatic way imaginable. Gorbachev, reforms that pulled out the imperial foundation. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary. He faced a broken system. Stagnant economy. Failing industries. Corrupt bureaucracy. Massive military spending. A population becoming cynical and resentful. His solution. Perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost, openness. These reforms were meant to save the Soviet Union. Instead, they accelerated its fall. Because in an authoritarian system, once you loosen the bolts even slightly, the entire machine risks coming apart. And come apart it did. 1989, the year the Soviet Empire dissolved in real time. For 40 years, communist regimes in Eastern Europe existed for one reason only. Because Moscow was willing to send tanks when they misbehaved. Hungary 1956. Czechoslovakia 1968. But in 1989, Gorbachev made a decision that changed world history. The Soviet Union will not use force to keep Eastern Europe in line. This single statement detonated decades of authoritarian stability. Suddenly, every Eastern European nation realized. The Soviet tank divisions were still there. But the Kremlin's will to use them was gone. This triggered stage 3, peripheral losses at a speed never seen before. Poland, June 1989. Solidarity won partially free elections, the communist regime collapsed. Hungary, summer 1989. Opened its border with Austria, East Germans fled by the thousands. East Germany, autumn 1989. Mass protests swelled. The government panicked. A confused spokesman accidentally announced that border crossings to West Germany were open immediately. Crowds surged to the Berlin Wall. The guards, unsure and unsupported by Moscow, let them through. November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The symbol of the Cold War collapsed in a single night. And then, the cascade. Czechoslovakia, regime collapsed. Bulgaria, regime collapsed. Romania, dictator executed. Albania, regime collapsed. Yugoslavia, slid toward fragmentation. From June to December 1989, just 6 months, the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe evaporated. Territory and influence the USSR had held for nearly half a century were gone. This wasn't decline. This was detonation. And now, the shockwave returned to the heart of the empire. Stage 4, the core collapses, 900 days from superpower to nothing. Once Eastern Europe left the Soviet orbit, the Soviet republics themselves asked. If Poland can leave Moscow's control, why can't we? Then came the sequence. 1990. Lithuania declared independence. Latvia and Estonia followed. August 1991. Hardliners attempted a coup to restore control. It failed in 3 days, the military would not support it. From that moment, the Soviet Union was already dead. It just hadn't held its funeral yet. December 25, 1991. Gorbachev resigned as president. December 26, 1991. The USSR formally dissolved. The speed is jaw-dropping. From the fall of the Berlin Wall to the end of the USSR, 900 days. From global superpower to disappearance, less than 3 years. This is the fastest imperial collapse in recorded history. And it teaches the most frightening lesson of all. Empires collapse faster than anyone expects, including the people inside them. Why the Soviet collapse matters now, the American parallel. In 1991, the United States became the sole global superpower. This was America's stage 1, peak dominance. But today, in 2025, the United States is unmistakably in Stage 3, peripheral losses. The signs are everywhere. Afghanistan, lost in a humiliating week. Iraq, cost $2 trillion for no strategic gain. Saudi Arabia, ended the 50-year petrodollar agreement. Turkey, ignored US pressure, bought Russian missiles. BRICS, expanded, creating an alternative financial system. Dollar dominance, eroding as countries trade in currencies other than USD. The US has 750 military bases. Commitments to defend NATO, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Israel, Saudi Arabia. $36 trillion in debt. $1 trillion per year in interest. $2 trillion annual deficits. A currency whose reserve status is no longer unquestioned. This is not speculation. This is not ideology. This is the historical pattern, repeating with eerie precision. Ottomans, Stage 3 collapse within a decade. British, Stage 3 collapse within 25 years. Soviets, Stage 3 collapse within 900 days. America, Stage 3 timeline unknown, but accelerating. The fall of the dollar's reserve status would trigger massive inflation. Treasury market crisis. Loss of military funding. Withdrawal from global bases. Strategic abandonment of allies. Fragmentation of political legitimacy at home. In other words, Stage 4. And because America is the core of the global financial system. Unlike the Soviet Union, whose collapse didn't crash world markets. When the American system breaks, the entire global economy goes with it. That means the collapse could move even faster than 900 days. Financial systems operate at the speed of electrons. Confidence evaporates faster than empires can respond. This is the danger. The final lesson: no empire believes it will collapse, until it does. Every empire in this story believed it was exceptional. Every empire believed history couldn't touch it. Every empire believed its institutions were too strong, its influence too deep, its power too obvious. Every empire was wrong. Ottomans lost the Balkans dead in a decade. British lost India dead in 25 years. Soviets lost Eastern Europe dead in 900 days. America lost Afghanistan and is now losing dollar supremacy and global loyalty. The pattern is real. The math is inescapable. The timing is the only unknown. What comes after the American empire may be a multipolar world. A fragmented global system. A diminished United States. Or something entirely new. But history is not sentimental. When Stage 4 arrives, it doesn't knock. It kicks the door in. If this opened your eyes to where America stands in the imperial cycle, stay ready. Because when the dollar breaks, when allies defect, when commitments can no longer be funded, Stage 4 will not be a metaphor. It will be a moment. And it will come faster than anyone expects.